Riley's Ghost by John David Anderson. Riley Flynn refused to make the cut. Sure, it was already dead, but she wasn't about to mutilate it further, impaling its feet with sharp pins, stretching its spindly legs to the corners, exposing its leathery belly to the glinting blade. She knew others around her secretly relished the thought of splaying it, teasing it out the organs, slicing its shriveled stomach to see if they could find any leftovers from its last meal. She could see it in their eyes. Sadists, barbarians, seventh graders. They would poke and prod, making faces as they severed its aorta and stabbed it repeatedly in the heart. They would laugh and squeal and fake gag, despite everything they'd been told about self-control and adding their age and respecting the scientific enterprise. But not her. Riley had gotten out of it. There was a Northridge Middle School permission slip with "My son/daughter does not want to participate" checked off, and the Amanda Flynn scrawled on the line beneath looked close enough to her mother's real signature to pass. It looked like the other signatures the school had on file, at least. On permission slips and missing homework forms, on intention slips, and on target notices, of which there were some. Riley had learned to perfectly imitate her mother's rushed A's, lolling N's, and flourishing capital F. It was a talent of hers. This whole middle school student thing didn't work out. She figured she could always drop out and find work as a check forger. And some days this middle school student thing really felt like it wasn't working out. "Today we start our dissections," Mr. Barnum said, clearing his throat to get the class's attention. Mr. Boredom, as some kids, not her, had dubbed him, was wearing his lab coat, the one with the too noticeable mustard stain on the lapel. At least Riley figured it for mustard. Some of the other students had a different theory, except what they were thinking wouldn't be that yellow. But around here, anything could inspire whispered ridicule. Every little past indiscretion, real or rumored, could be dredged up to haunt you while you were walking through the halls. Even teachers weren't immune. Honestly, Riley didn't think Mr. Barnum was that bad. He fell into the category of teachers that who no longer liked spending time with kids, but had an unlikable passion for the subject that Riley could appreciate. Mr. B could go on for hours about the wonders of evolution and the marvelous machine that is the human body, and don't even get him started on the carbon atom. Each year he found a new devotees, students who cared about science as much as he did, and that alone seemed to motivate him to make it to summer and come back again in the fall. That and being 4 years in retirement. Rumor had it he wanted to move to Key West so he could save the sea turtles and write his novel about a middle school science teacher who uses his superior intellect to solve crimes. Riley was not one of Mr. Barnum's devotees. Science was fine, better than math, not quite as good as language arts, but it certainly wasn't something she felt passionate about. She was content to just sit quietly in her corner and earn her B without complaint, at least until the dissection unit came around. Then she decided to stand her ground. "I'm handing out your kits, which contain your specimen, your tray, and your tools. Do not touch the scalpel until I give you further instructions. Understood? I see anyone holding a blade before the frogs are properly mounted, and they will be immediately excused from the lesson and sent to Principal Wharton." Some of the students oohed, others laughed as they repeated the phrase "properly mounted." Riley kept her mouth shut. She wouldn't mind being excused from lessons, but she certainly didn't want to see Teresa again. Being on a first-name basis with the principal wasn't something she'd be proud of. Okay, they weren't really that close, but she could describe the interior decor of Teresa Wharton's office in detail, down to the tarnished 8-year-old Administrator of the Year award and color of the thumbtacks holding up the cheese motivational posters on the wall. The one showing the kitten with its head stuck in the glass was her favorite. Posters said "Perseverance," presumably because the kitty was angling for those last drops of milk at the bottom of the glass. To Riley, though, it looked like the poor thing had regretted its decision and just wanted to get out. "When you remove your specimen, you may notice a rather pungent odor." That's what she said, Quist Winters quipped, low enough that Mr. Barnum couldn't hear, but everyone within the surrounding tables could, including Riley. "Could you be any more disgusting?" Grace Turner said, slapping him lightly on the arm. Riley's thoughts exactly, except if Riley had said it, she wouldn't have smiled coyly, and she certainly wouldn't have added the playful little slap. Grace's flirting was as subtle as an atomic bomb. Of course, if Riley had said it, Chris would have given her a dirty look and told her exactly what he thought of her opinion, which was that she was entitled to one. That's how it had been all year. Grace and her friends had made it clear what they thought of her, and Riley had returned the favor, mostly through cutting side eyes and behind the back gestures of the single finger variety. Of course, part of the problem was that Grace had friends, more than some, and Riley had history. Chris whispered something in Grace's ear, earning another arm slap. If the smell of the persevered frog didn't make Riley sick, watching these two stumble through each other's hormonal fogs would. All around the room, students were prying open their Ziploc bags containing their corpses and dumping them in their wax-lined trays. Riley started breathing through her mouth. "It smells like the fish sandwich they serve in the cafeteria. It smells like the boys' bathroom." Grace pinched her nose and spoke in a nasally whine. "This is actually the grossest thing I've ever seen in my life." Actually was Grace's favorite word. She used it in place of literally because she said she was tired of people using the word wrong. even though she was actually the same way. It drove Riley nuts. Not actually nuts, but almost. Mr. Bardem told everyone to stop complaining. The smell really wasn't that bad, and they would get used to it, which seemed to Riley to be a much better caption for the stuck kitten poster in the principal's office. Life stinks, get used to it. The diagram on the board shows how the specimen should be pinned in the tray. Remember to put your gloves on first, and please, please, please do not stick each other or yourself with the pins. They will draw blood. Take 5 minutes to set up. And Mr. Standler, do not let me see you trimming your bangs with the dissecting scissors again. This is not preschool and you are not 4. Jared Standler put down his scissors. The girl next to him rolled her eyes. The next table over, Chris was pretending to be the psychopath in the slasher movie, making screechy violin sound as he mock murdered his already dead frog. Riley looked at the empty space on the marble desk in front of her, the only one without a tray and a dead amphibian. Mr. Bardem grabbed a bag from his desk and then circled around the room, checking to make sure that everyone was more or less following directions, making grotesque X's out of their shriveled frog bodies, ready to slice and dice. Finally, he got to Riley, sitting by herself at the back of the room. I have something for you, he said. He reached into the bag and removed a pair of VR goggles, the black chunky kind that looked like something out of a bad 1970s science fiction movie. I was going to just let you do the walkthrough on your laptop again. This will be a much more immersive experience. As he talked, Mr. Bardem took his phone out of his back pocket and attached it to the goggles, clicking it into place. It's an app called VR Dissection, he continued. They have all kinds of specimens, pigs, cats, even human cadavers. But I think we will just stick for frog for today. He handed Riley the headgear. Suddenly, he was acutely aware of the many sets of eyes on her. Hey, how come she gets to use a cool tech while the rest of us have to futz around with Croker's McCorpsey here? Marcus Coulson whined. You worry about your own performance, Mr. Coulson. It should be a full-time job at this point. There was one reason Riley tolerated this class. Mr. Bardem was at least quick with the burn. Of course, Riley was prepared to tell Marcus Coulson and anyone who would listen why she refused to do this section. How it was unnecessary and wasteful in the age of modern technology for 7th graders to chop up dead frogs just to figure out where the liver was located. This VR app she was about to use was proof. If Riley had plans to grow up and become a herpetologist, then maybe actual dissection would be useful. How many budding frog scientists were there in this room? Half of these kids probably wouldn't even make it to college. Riley fully intended to go to college, provided she survived middle school and the 4 years after that. Just press play and put the goggles on, Mr. Bardem informed her. Pause it if you need a break. It's a little slow, but the narrative is pretty good. He reminds me of James Earl Jones. Who? Riley asked. Mufasa? Darth Vader? Riley nodded. She was going to watch Darth Vader dissect a frog instead of doing it herself. Well worth forging her mom's signature. Maybe he would use a lightsaber. She put the earbuds in, hoping they'd be sanitized since the last kid had used them, and settled the goggles on her head, pulling her wavy auburn hair through the back. At least she wouldn't have to watch her fellow classmates make fools of themselves, though she'd hate to miss it if Marcus or Chris or even Grace screwed up and accidentally scalped off a finger. Riley tried to block out reality. She had some practice at this and concentrated on the virtual run before her eyes. Sure enough, after 5 seconds of elementary music, a nasally version of the King Mufasa started narrating. We are about to make a journey into the inner workings of nature, exploring the biological wonders that make life of all kinds possible. She sat back in her chair and watched the virtual dissection. It was just as good as the real thing, probably better. She had close-ups and diagrams and animations and the voice of a Sith Lord walking her through it as she panned across a 3-dimensional model. Plus, she didn't have to watch Chris and Grace ogle each other. She could just tune them all out. Center of the cardiovascular system is the heart. As she watched the digital frog's heart pump, Riley thought that she felt something touch her lips, fleetingly, just a tickle. She wiped them with the back of her hand. There was nothing there, though now she thought she could hear someone laughing. Just beyond the edge of her earbuds, it was hard to tell, over the narrator describing the intricate network of blood vessels coursing through the frog's body. Because frogs, of course, are ectothermic, meaning cold-blooded, unlike humans. Felt it again, less fleeting this time. Something cold and clammy pressed up to her upper lip. She was sure of it. Riley pulled the goggles up with one hand to see a dead frog hovering right in front of her face, the silvery membrane clouding its black marble eyes, its thin mouth set in a disapproving frown. And Chris Winters holding it there, barely containing his laughter. Oops, he said, making his voice unnaturally throaty and guttural. Kermit the Frog at the Muppet was a heavy smoker. Thought you were a beautiful princess, my lord. My bad. He made the frog's face bounce up and down like it was talking, only an inch from Riley's own. Laughter rang in Riley's ears, coming from all directions, at least a dozen people watching. Riley's blood boiled. She took a step back, tipping the VR goggles off her head, sagging them in her hair, which only caused her to pull harder. They slipped out of her hands and hit the cement floor with a sickening smack. Mr. Bardem, who was looking over the shoulders of 2 students at the front, spun at the sound. The dead frog retreated from in front of Riley's face as did Chris, quickly turning back to his table and tossing a specimen into his tray. Riley glared at him, her laser eyes set to disintegrate. "What is going on back there?" Mr. Barnum said, clearly annoyed. Riley looked down at the goggles on the floor with Mr. Barnum's phone inside, then over at Chris, who was desperately trying to keep a straight face. Heat rose to her cheeks. She was not ectothermic, obviously, though she was tempted to go thermonuclear. She wanted to take that dead frog and shove it straight down Chris's throat until he choked on it. She was about to say something to that effect when Mr. Barnum hustled to the back of the room, mustard-stained coat flapping behind him. He wasn't looking at Chris, though. He was looking back and forth from Riley to the goggles on the floor. The room was silent, all eyes pulled in her direction again. The center of attention, just never in a good way. "I'm sorry, Mr. Barnum," Riley began. "It wasn't my fault. Chris made his dead freaking frog kiss me, and I kind of panicked." "She's lying," Chris protested. "My stupid frog's lying right there," he pointed. Mr. Barnum looked at Chris's digestion tray. His frog sprawled in a heap, belly down. Everyone else already had theirs pinned and was working on the first cut. Riley wasn't sure what Mr. Barnum had seen, but it must have been enough. He pointed to Chris. "You, out in the hall, now. Take your backpack. You are returning." "What?" "You heard me. Out," Mr. Barnum commanded. He bent down to retrieve the goggles, but kept his eyes on Chris, making sure he followed orders. For his part, Chris made sure to take an empty stool on his way, just in case anyone was unclear how he felt about his clear injustice. Mr. Barnum removed the phone from the headset and inspected it, sighing in relief. Not even scratched. Riley sighed as well. This would have been the second phone she'd broken this year, but her sigh was tinged with disappointment. If she had to put a wager on it, Riley would say that Mr. Barnum was more worried about his phone screen than why she had dropped it in the first place. "Maybe it would be better for you to stick to the video tutorial," he said, putting the phone back in his pocket. "I didn't mean to," Riley protested. "Seriously, he had that frog right up in my face." "I understand, Miss Flynn," Mr. Barnum interrupted. "I promise I will deal with Mr. Winters. We need to be more careful with school equipment. A little dead frog not going to kill you." Riley got the message. Chris was wrong and would be punished for acting like a jerk. This was middle school. Mean and stupid came with the territory. Had to learn to deal, to control yourself. Even when someone did something to tick you off. It was a lesson she should have learned long ago. Just hadn't stuck yet. Riley looked at the trays full of specimens pinned in place, waiting to be cut up, pulled apart, to literally spill their guts. She sort of envied them. At least they couldn't feel it. Chapter 2. She hid her face behind her computer for the rest of fifth period, the only one with the table to herself. Anyone walking by would have seen she had the detention video pulled up, but Riley was staring straight through it, right through it, thinking only about what an apocalyptic a-hole Chris Winters had been, was, and would always be. Every now and then she would wipe her lips on the sleeve of her sweatshirt, hoping nobody would see. She was afraid to lick them, certain she would taste the formaldehyde. She could still feel the frog's cold, dead mouth on hers. It was almost as nasty as the looks Grace Turner continued to sling her at her from the next table over. "Just ignore it. She's not worth it. Be better than that." The last part was her mom talking. Be better. Be bigger. Just float above it all. Hard to float when people kept dragging you down. She closed her eyes and waited for the bell to ring, and quickly made her escape, the first to leave, as everyone else still had to bag up their half-dissected corpses, depositing them in the supply room that Mr. Barnum kept locked because he was afraid some half-wit student would sneak in and try to make magic potions out of the chemicals there and end up drinking hydrochloric acid and needing a stomach pump. It was little more than a walk-in closet lined with metal shelving, now a temporary tomb for a few dozen dead frogs. Riley ducked out of the room and down the hall and straight into the bathroom, where she quickly washed her face, scrubbing her lips with a creative-tasting soap. Then she slipped into the last stall, still shaking from frustration at the door banged shut. She perched on the back of the toilet, feet on the lid, backpack between them. It was a familiar spot. She spent an unhealthy amount of middle school in these stalls, so much so that she had some of the graffiti memorized. Sometimes this was the only place you could go when nobody could see you. She blotted her eyes with a wad of tissue. It wasn't even that big a deal. A dead frog can't kill you. Laughter can't either. And it's not as if this was the first time Chris Winters or someone like him had picked on her. Riley had seen a target from her first day at Northridge. Sideways glances, little snickers, rumors that eventually got back to her. That she was depressed, that she was on medication. She said nasty things about other people behind their backs, which was ludicrous, really. If she had something to say, she would probably just tell you to her face. One of the reasons she'd spent so much time in Teresa's office, with its rickety leather chairs and the word-a-day calendar and that poor stuffed kitten. It wasn't supposed to be like this. Her mother had insisted that middle school would be different, bigger, more diverse, more opportunities, sports, social events, clubs, classes, dances. Leave it to her mother to see school dances as a selling point. A herd of sweaty teenagers in a stuffy gym with stale cookies and Ed Sheeran on repeat. Riley would rather have her eyeballs pecked out of their sockets by a murder of crows. Then again, nobody asked her to go to any of the school dances yet, so it wasn't really an issue. Oops, thought you were a beautiful princess. My bad. She should have punched him. That's what she wanted to do. Snapped the frog right out of his hand, then wiped the stupid grin off his face with a follow-up right hook. Her dad had taught her how to throw a good punch. Hips and shoulders. Get your body behind it. Use your weight. She could have bloodied his nose. Except knocking Chris Winters unconscious would undoubtedly have led to a suspension, which would have led to her parents flipping out again. It would have gone on her record, right below the other things she'd said and done. Suck it up, she told herself. Stop hiding in the bathroom stall like a coward and get to class before you get into any more trouble. Riley wiped her nose, then gathered herself together and unlocked the stall. She didn't realize anyone else was in the bathroom until she saw Naomi Waters, a fellow Sevi, standing at the sink, expecting a zit on her chin. Naomi wasn't a friend by any stretch, but Riley didn't have anything against her either. Most people in Riley's life fit neatly into that category. You okay? Riley sniffed. I'm fine. She went to the sink and splashed cold water on her face. Really? Could look like you've been crying. Criley Flynn, Criley Flynn. Say her name, she cries again. I'm fine, really. Whatever. Naomi finished fiddling with her chimple, grabbed her bag, and left just as the bell for the next period rang. Terrific. On top of everything else, Riley would be late for social studies. This would make the third time, which meant Mrs. Kingsley would either have to note home or make a phone call. The note she could handle. The phone call was a different story. Luckily, Riley knew the chances of reaching her mother at home today were slim. She was working a 10-hour shift at the hospital and wouldn't be back until midnight. Riley could probably leave the voicemail herself anyway. She knew how they went. Hi, Mrs. Flynn. This is Sandra Kingsley, your daughter's social teacher. I'm calling with some concerns about Riley, particularly her habit of being tardy and turning her homework in late, not participating in class, sometimes nodding off, not always working well with others, and. Granted, none of these things was terrible in its own right. Lord knew she'd done worse, but they were starting to add up. Riley took a deep breath, reminding herself that at least the day was almost over, with 2 more periods to go. Neither of them did she have to share with Chris Winters, Grace Turner, or dead frogs. Though the three, she picked the frogs in a heartbeat. Number 3. Already there were whispers and looks. It seemed like they were always whispers and looks. The feeling like somebody's following you. That's what it was like. But of course, every time you turn around to catch them, there's nothing there. When Miss Kingsley gave them time at the end of class to get started on their homework, and phones wiggled furtively from backpacks and sweatshirts pockets and sweetly swiped underneath desks, Riley could just tell that some of the messages were about her. She could easily imagine the kinds of things that were being texted all across the school. Did you hear what happened in Boredom's class? Woodhouse was kicked out of science. Flynn totally flipped. Though she was thought she was going to stab Chris with his own scalpel. Wouldn't put it past her. That girl is cray-cray. Riley sat with her history book open on her desk. Some sidebar about boots, Indian spirits that could possess human bodies and could be identified by their backward feet, only getting half the words because every minute or so one of her classmates would look down at her phone and then steal a quick glance at Riley in the back corner. At least she thought they were looking at her. You're just imagining it, she told herself. They don't care about what you did in science class, not even a blip on their radar. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone's eyes were on her every time she looked back at her book. Of course, she couldn't check her own phone to see what people were posting because it was still resting in peace on top of her dresser, its screen busted, an ornate spiderweb of cracks that rendered it inoperable. Hadn't meant to break it. Not really. She'd been aiming for the open closet full of clothes, but her arc had been off and the phone caught the corner of her desk dresser instead, the crack of the glass instantly causing Riley's stomach to clench. It was an impulse, a surge of bitter energy that overrode all the controls and caused her to lash out, her body reacting, funneling her anger into a concentrated outburst that sent her phone, an Instagram picture of 5 girls posing, straight into the solid oak dresser. Flynn totally flipped. She lied to her parents, of course. She said she dropped it on the sidewalk on the way home from school. She begged for a new one, but the Flynns were less than 2 months away from the upgrade on their contract with the phone company, insisted she could wait. It would teach her to be more responsible with her things. Maybe next time she'd hold on a little tighter. Sometimes things slip out no matter how tightly you hold them. She couldn't argue, though. She knew she only had herself to blame. She could have closed her eyes, sucked down a deep breath, and counted to 10 like she was supposed to. She could have gone outside and screamed. She could have done what her father did when he got mad and punched the refrigerator. Connor Flynn wasn't a small man by any measure and could easily put his fist through a wall. The refrigerator door was solid and took the punch with indifference. Or better yet, she could have followed her mother's lead and quietly stewed. But instead, she'd reacted in a typical Riley Flynn fashion, doing something that only ended up hurting herself. And for what? The picture wasn't even that big a deal. Just 5 girls Riley knew sitting at a table, huddled around a cheesecake with 13 flickering candles. Celebrating B-Day with my besties, the post read. Her besties. Riley knew all 5 girls in the photo, but only one had she ever been friends with. Good friends. Besties, even. Once upon a time. Still, it was just a picture. Not worth busting your phone over. It's not as if she would have gone to the B-Day anyway, even if she had been invited. Riley couldn't stand cheesecake. Yet, staring at the photo and all those girls with their glossy, pouting lips and throwing peace signs, something inside her had snapped. The same feeling she got glaring into Chris Winter's smug little face, fantasizing about how that formaldehyde-soaked frog would taste when she made him choke on it. The same feeling that hit her walking through the doors of this building every morning. That with every step she took, she was getting smaller and smaller, shrinking down to nothing, to nobody. On the other side of the room, a boy named Sean snorted a laugh, cleared his throat, and pretended to go back to his book, with the haunting boots in their backward feet. Next to him, Emily Saunders glanced up from her own phone and looked around the room. The girl who'd been sitting in the center of that photo that caused Riley's phone to fly, who blew out all those candles with her new best friends, caught Riley's eye and then quickly looked away. Chapter 4. They'd met a little over a year ago. Emily had needed saving, and Riley had come to her rescue, her knight in well-worn flannel. She considered looking away, just passing by, doing nothing like all the other students. But she didn't. She couldn't, because she'd seen this trick before. She'd been up on her way to first period, early for once, when she overheard Caleb Crossley, a seventh grader who was way too proud of his feathery hair and his starting spot on the middle school football team, trying to mess with some girl Riley didn't recognize. They were standing in the center of the vestibule, Caleb and one of his friends and this girl, all of them staring at the Northridge emblem, its panther mascot growling up at them from the floor, claws extended. The girl looked wide-eyed and more than a little lost. Riley could see that she had a sheet of paper, a copy of her schedule, perhaps, clutched in her hands. New student, first day. Fresh meat. The front of the school had mostly emptied at this point, everyone either at their lockers or headed to class, which was exactly where Riley was supposed to be going. She only stopped when she overheard Crossley's voice and the truckload of bull he was dumping. It was tradition that on the first day you show your respects to the panther. The girl shook her head, confused. She was pretty, Riley thought. More importantly for Caleb, though, she was alone. Nervous, nervous laughter followed by a, "What?" Everybody does it. It's kind of like this ritual thing. You just get on your hands and knees and bow down to it. You know, like this. Caleb made the motions with his arms, though he didn't bother to get on his knees. The girl's cat yellow eyes squinted. You're joking, right? I mean, nobody does that. No joke. I did it my first day as a sixth grader. Everybody does it. Like I said, it's tradition. It's like brings you good luck for the next 3 years. That's when the girl glanced over at Riley standing at the periphery, a nervous look, and Riley decided she had heard enough. Don't do it, she said. Nobody asked you, noob, Caleb said, dismissing Riley with rolled eyes. He turned back to the new girl. Don't listen to her. She's a lunatic. Riley bristled, ground her teeth. In her head, she perfectly pictured herself swinging out with her backpack, catching Caleb Crossley in the gut, but she managed to keep her cool. She looked at the girl instead. Trust me, it's a prank. He just wants you to get on your hands and knees in the middle of the school and take a picture of you. Caleb turned a bright shade of pink. He opened his mouth to say something, but Riley cut him off. Seriously, let it go, Crossley, or one of us will be doubled over on the ground. Riley backed up the threat with a pointed, some might even say dangerous, look. The pink in Caleb's cheeks shifted to red. For a moment, Riley wondered if she'd stepped over that line again, the one she didn't always see, or sometimes saw and just ignored. The principal's office was less than 50 feet away. She'd only been a Northwood Panther for 5 weeks. It would suck to be sent to the office already, but there was no backing down now. Hold your ground, Riley. Stand up straight. She waited for Caleb to flex on her or fire back, but the warning bell telling them that they had 3 minutes left to get to class seemed to take some of the fire out of his cheeks. Man, whatever. Not worth it. He dismissed both girls with a wave of his arms, retreating down the hall with his friend. Riley and the new girl stared at each other awkwardly until the latter spoke up. Thanks for that. I wasn't sure what to do. He's a prick, Riley said matter-of-factly. The school's full of them. The idea is while you're on the ground, he stands in front of you so it looks like you're actually bowing down to him instead. Then his buddy gets a pic and they post it online with some caption about him being worshipped by all the girls in the school. It's perverted. People fall for that? Not me. And now not you either. I'm Riley, by the way. Emily. First day? The girl nodded. Just moved here. And you hate it already? Emily shrugged. Too early to tell, I guess. Trust me, it won't take long to form an opinion, Riley said. She turned to go, figuring it wouldn't pay to be tardy again. The new girl held up a piece of paper. Any chance you can tell me how to get to D Hall? D Hall, the armpit of the school, situated at the very back of the building. If Riley walked this girl all the way there, she would most definitely be late to class. To class. But there were worse things. Come on, I'll show you. That was the day Riley Flynn saved Emily Saunders from school-wide humiliation. It was also the day she found someone to sit with at lunch. Chapter 5. When the final bell rang, signaling another day of torture had ended, Riley was the last to leave the room. It wasn't that she particularly liked algebra or her teacher, Miss Schweitz, who smelled of cigarette smoke and never trimmed his piratical beard. It was just that she was in no hurry to get home, where all that waited for her was a lean cuisine, a pile of homework, and a new episode of Cobra Kai. That's how it was whenever Dad was gone and Mom worked late, every rally for herself. She'd be back soon. She had the date circled on her wall calendar in blue marker. November 13th. 2 more days. Until then, with Mom working late at the hospital, Riley would either have to learn to cook something more than mac and cheese or be satisfied with microwave dinners. It wasn't the food she minded, though microwave dinners were nothing if not forgettable. It was the quiet. There was something momentarily heart-stopping about walking into an empty house, sitting in the doorway, staring into the shadowy living room, flipping the switch to find that there was nobody there to ask you how your day was or if you were hungry or wanted a snack. Hardly any sound at all, save for the creak of the floorboard on your first step. That's where Riley always turned on the television when she first walked in, to whatever channel she or Mom had been watching last, just for the comforting background noise, just to hear another voice. It was the thought of that dark and empty house that kept Riley loitering in the hall that afternoon instead of rushing to the school's front exit. She took the long way, cutting through D Hall with its posters of Paris and Nice, Madrid and Cadiz, and places she'd like to visit someday, mostly because they were far from the town of Northridge. The hall housed the foreign language classes, as well as all the unused lockers. Enrollment in the district had been going down steadily over the years, and there were always more lockers and students now, so the ones lining D Hall were perennially unoccupied, making it something of a ghost town after hours. It made a more peaceful walk, at least, which with less chance for bumped shoulders or dirty looks. Honestly, Riley wouldn't mind moving her locker here, even though some of those probably hadn't been open for decades. She imagined at least one of them probably contained some disgusting artifact from the last student's user. A dirty sock, a shriveled orange furry with mold, a notebook full of inappropriate drawings, something discarded and long ago forgotten. The school was emptying in front of her, vomiting kids out of every exit. Most of the time, students weren't allowed to hang around the school unless they were part of a team or a club that had practice. Riley had an out, a way to put off the empty house that awaited her. She turned and headed toward the glass doors, waving hello to the poster of Garfield in the window, the fat orange cat contently sleeping on top of a stack of books. Hi, Mrs. Grissom. Riley Flint, just a girl I figured I'd see. Hi, Mrs. Grissom, Riley said, closing the library door behind her. Did you miss me? Mrs. Grissom winked, the smile that followed blunting the edge of a hard day. The librarian reminded Riley a little of her mother. She had kind crow's feet, cornered, cornered eyes, and a mess of dark hair at the junction of curl and frizz, plus a dimple-dotted smile. Except whereas Riley's mom was an imposing 5'10", Mrs. Grissom stood shorter than half of her students. She had to lift onto her tippy toes to get books from the top shelf. Some kids made fun of her, called her short stack or little G, but those kids never bothered to come to the library. Riley doubted they even knew how to read. Riley took a deep, calming breath, feeling more at ease already. She liked this place, the smell of so many books. She liked the patterns the spines made aligned on the shelves, the lumpy beanbag chairs propped in the corners, the hand-me-down sofa against the back wall with the stuffing spewing out of one arm. The juxtaposition here that Riley relished, the orderliness of the tiles marching in a line cast against the ragtag thrift shop nature of the furniture. Librarian's desk was much the same. Perfect blocks of sticky notes and a tidy wire cup of sharp pencils, punctuated by an odd assortment of tchotchkes accumulated from Mrs. Griswold's summer vacations. A conch from Costa Rica, a surfing Santa Claus from Hawaii, a miniature Big Ben that shone on the hour. Order and chaos, just like life. Although the back shelf behind the desk sat Miss Griswold's menagerie of literary stuffies, plush animals that she'd gathered from trips to bookstores and library conferences. Curious George had one arm draped around Raggedy Ann, the monkey fleeting, flirtatious like always. Riley thought of Chris and Grace fawning over each other through science and resisted the urge to punch Curious George in the face. Want to help me process new arrivals? Miss Griswold asked. Riley smiled for the first time all day. She didn't mind cataloging books. Process itself was dull, affixing labels to spines or writing down reading levels that Mrs. Griswold really hardly paid attention to anyway. Read what excites you or satisfies your curiosity was more her motto. But it gave Riley first crack in new material. Get anything good? They're books. They're all good, Mrs. Griswold replied, though Riley knew that wasn't true. You get anything I would like? Let's see. The librarian started sorting a stack of shiny new hardbounds. 3 copies of the latest dystopian supernatural romance, some pretty good historical fiction, 2 books on UFOs, and this book about the world's ugliest animals that looks pretty interesting. This blobfish reminds me a bit of my grandfather. Mrs. Grissom held up the book in question so Riley could get a good look. Grandmother's a lucky lady. Riley said. Got any new manga? Manga was her latest thing. Okay, it wasn't a thing yet. To be honest, she was having a little trouble getting into it. But there were a group of girls that she sometimes sat with slash by slash in the vicinity of at lunch. It was definitely their thing. They talked about it constantly, and you can't sit for 25 minutes every day listening to other kids go on about Tokyo Ghoul and Death Note and not take a little interest. I've got this. Mrs. Grissom held up the newest volume of My Hero Academia. Riley kind of wanted it, but she knew that Aisha, one of the girls at the lunch table, would want it more. So she decided to check it out for her instead and give it to her in second period tomorrow. It's the kind of gesture her mother was always urging Riley to make. If you're nice to them, they'll be nice to you. Past experiences hadn't always borne this out, but she figured it was still worth a shot. She grabbed a stack of new editions along with the labels and the tape and sat down at the checkout desk to work. It was strictly volunteer labor, though Mrs. Lang, the part-time media assistant, sometimes paid her in M&Ms she kept stashed in her bottom desk drawer. Unfortunately, Mrs. Lang was nowhere to be seen. Your mom working late again tonight? Mrs. Grissom knew Riley's mother outside of school. Her husband was a lab tech who worked at the same hospital. Plus, sometimes Riley would complain to the librarian about her mother's demanding schedule, especially when it was raining outside and she didn't feel like walking home. Her house was only 5 blocks away, an easy distance on a sunny day, but a miserable hike in a downpour. She's got the evening shift all week, Riley said. Well, she's a saint. I thought teachers had it rough, but nurses, at least around here, you don't have to deal with people peeing into plastic bottles. Not most of it, anyway. Riley smiled and went back to her labels. Mrs. Grissom had started to stack books on a cart when Mrs. Lang came bustling in, shaking her head. Boys, she said with a huff, can't even walk straight. Mrs. Lang was at least a decade older than Mrs. Grissom, her gray hair several inches shorter, and her opinions sharper, or at least more readily offered. She wore a ring on every finger, every day, and not always the same set. Legend had it she had once followed the Grateful Dead on tour for 3 years straight, and she firmly believed that books were better company than people. Riley liked her for just that reason. That boy Winters, Miss Lane continued, he was running down the hall like a barbarian and tripped over his own feet, banged his chin and bloodied his lip. You'd think being on the basketball team mean he'd be a little more coordinated. You would think, Mrs. Grissom agreed. Riley smiled coyly, imagining Chris Winters' face planting in front of everyone, tripped by some unseen force of karma and justice. See, she didn't need to rearrange his face with her fist. Fate had stepped in to do it for her. Here, at the end, her day was finally looking up. Then it got even better. Mrs. Lang opened her bottom drawer and pulled out the bag of M&Ms. Chapter 6. Mrs. Grissom let her stick around until 5:30, shelving books and shoveling down chocolate until the carts were empty, at which point the librarian insisted it was time to close shop. Miss Lang had already clocked out for the day, as did nearly everyone else in the school. Riley checked out her books, including the one for Aisha, and stuffed them into her bag. Time to head home. An empty living room, an unsettling silence, and a nuked Alfredo pasta with chicken and broccoli and apple cobbler for dessert. They all came with apple cobbler, and all the apple cobblers taste the exact same. Riley took her time, meandering through the empty halls, stopping to admire some of the new sketches from Mr. Foot's art class and wondering if she might appreciate manga a little more if she knew how to draw. She wasn't a terrible artist. Her stick figures had fleshed out years ago. We wouldn't exactly call it a talent. She hadn't discovered much that she was particularly good at. In fact, there were things she cared strongly for. Her parents, animal rights, helping the environment. There were things she enjoyed, baking cupcakes, writing song lyrics that were never put to music, taking walks in the woods behind her house, but there wasn't anything that she really got her heart beating fast, except maybe being noticed by the group of girls who suddenly turned the corner, heading her way. There were four of them, all members of the volleyball team. Grace Turner, Danielle Mofi, Michelle something or other, and of course, Emily. They were all in their workout clothes, fresh from practice, hair pulled back, faces sheened. They moved as a flock, Emily hanging noticeably back a bit, Grace slightly ahead, her strawberry blonde ponytail in full bounce. She spotted Riley and her eyes narrowed. Crap buckets, Riley whispered. She looked around. She was halfway down the hall already, right next to the science lab. She could turn and go the other way, but she knew she shouldn't have to. She could put her head down and hope they let her pass without saying or doing anything, but she knew she shouldn't have to do that either. So instead, she kept walking, chin up, only stopping when Grace purposely sidestepped in front of her. Riley tried to catch Emily's eye, but the girl she'd once held hands with while leaping off the highest jump at the Pine Lake Water Park suddenly took a deep interest in the tops of her sketchers. Look who's still here. There isn't the princess. Grace's thick-lipped smirk looked even smirkier than usual. Riley was pleased to see that she stood at least a full inch taller than the girl facing her. They're both Danielle and Michelle, the two L's. were the middle school equivalent of giants. Unlike Emily, whom she knew, and Grace, whom she couldn't stand, the other two were question marks. But it was clear this was a team effort with Grace as the captain, and Riley had no doubt that they would do whatever the leader said. The two stood less than 3 feet apart. Riley stared Grace down, hoping she'd flinch a step aside. It worked sometimes, not this one. Grace was clearly ticked. Riley could almost see the steam snaking from the girl's nostrils. Do you know what happened because of your little tantrum in science today? Riley cocked her head. Excuse me? She'd hardly call it a tantrum. Tantrum would have been Riley taking the dissection tray and smashing it over Chris Winter's head. Because of your freak out, Chris has in-school suspension tomorrow, which means he's not allowed to play in Friday's game, which means his parents are probably going to ground him for the whole weekend, which means he and I won't see each other. All because you can't take a stupid joke. She spewed all of this without taking a breath. The L's had their arms crossed like a couple of thugs in a gangster movie. So cliche. Emily still wouldn't look at her, so accepted. Riley felt herself quarreling, an all too familiar feeling. She really thought she'd put this day behind her. The exit was less than 50 feet away. So close. She could still make it, she thought. Just apologize and hope Grace dropped it and let her slide by. Be better, Riley. Float above. Sorry, she muttered, sucking it up, choking it down. You should be, Grace snapped back. Should be? Riley tensed, cheeks burning, jaw clenched. Everything grew heavy inside her. No chance of floating now. You let me finish, she said, offering up her biggest, fakest smile. What I meant was, I'm sorry I didn't want to kiss your boyfriend's dead frog today. It's just that, unlike some people, I don't make out with things that are brain dead. Grace Turner's mouth twitched. The L's gave her sideways glances, and it looked as if a hint of a smile might have flashed across Emily's lips. There was a pause, long enough that Riley could tell that she had the other girl pinned. But Grace quickly recovered, snorting dismissively. Who the hell would actually want to kiss you? She took a step toward Riley, one finger aimed at Riley's chest, inching closer and closer. In fact, if I were you, I would have made out with the frog, because that's probably the only action you'll ever get. The last word, Grace poked Riley just below the collar of her sweatshirt, breaking the imaginary force field she had put around herself, the one designed to keep Riley in more than other people out. Her chest burned above her heart where Grace's finger had just been. Riley thought of that frog hovering an inch from her face. It was there, a permanent image in her brain, right next to the sketch of a maze with no exit, a jagged line scratched across its center, a handful of animal crackers buried in a bed of brown mulch, the snowstorm of confetti falling outside her window. She felt herself cracking. She tried to count to 10 like her counselor taught her. She didn't even get the two. It happened so fast, a spike of adrenaline that bypassed her mother's cautioning voice, the one Riley had long ago internalized, concentrating all the frustration in Riley's tight arm, which uncoiled unconsciously, tweaking fast, the open hand connecting with Grace's left cheek. With just force, it made the other girl's head whip around. Riley felt the sting of contact in her fingers, tingling its way clear back up her arm to her shoulder. The slap sounded like the 4th of July. It felt a little like Christmas. Riley could already see the outline of her fingers on Grace's cheek, a festive white imprint with a red aura. Grace reached up tentatively, exploring the tender edge of the mark, her mouth wide with shock. Surprise faded quickly, replaced by cold, avalanching anger. You are so going to pay for that, she seethed. The L's moved like one, like wolves. Before Riley knew it, both of her arms were pinned against the lockers, back pressed against the metal, helpless, waiting for Grace and her friends to tear her apart. Chapter 7. Mr. Bardem always locked the door to the laboratory equipment closet, but he also always kept the key in the top drawer of his desk. Riley had seen him sneak it back in today after he put away the detection kits. He wasn't the only one who noticed. What are you doing? Get off me. I told you. Grace's voice was unnervingly normal, almost cheerful. You went too far, and I had to pay. Riley floundered and flabbed, kicked and thrashed, her once burning anger turning to cold fear. The elves dragged her by both arms, her feet barely touching the floor. She quickly switched tactics. Seriously, Grace, I'm sorry I slapped you. Just let me go of me. She wasn't actually sorry, but she wasn't regretting it, if only because the two elves were now pushing her through the science lab towards the supply closet while Grace retrieved the key from Bardem's desk. The girls on each arm had 20 pounds on her apiece. She tried wrenching out of their grips, but like those woven finger traps you sometimes get at party favors, that only made them squeeze harder. Grace ordered the other girls about, asserting her status as both entitled victim and alpha wolf. Em, stay by the door. Keep a lookout. Riley saw Emily's eyebrows cinch, her hazel eyes narrow. It looked like might say something, but she kept her mouth shut and stood fidgeting by the doorway, stealing alternating glances at the hall and the wrestling match happening inside. Riley tried to dig in her heels to skid to a stop, but her sneakers couldn't find purchase on the smooth cement as the girls muscled her closer to the unlocked supply closet door where Grace stood waiting, key dangling from her hand. Let go of me or I swear I'll scream, Riley warned. Then somebody will come down here and see what's going on, and all of you will be suspended. Right. And you think when I tell them about how you hit me first that they're just going to let you go? I have 3 witnesses. You've got nobody. Plus, only one of us has a reputation for being a troublemaker. You've got nobody. I looked toward Emily, straddling the entryway, 1 foot in, 1 foot out. They'd been friends once, not even that long ago. Ice cream buddies, going to Dairy Queen and sitting on the bench outside, hovering over one large mint Oreo blizzard, with their foreheads almost touching. For most of a year, they'd shared flip-flops and lip balm. They'd drawn rainbows on each other's knees in permanent marker. They locked elbows while ice skating, each of them dragging their other down. They had slept overnight in Emily's queen bed, knees bent and bodies curved so that their combined shape approached infinity. Riley knew Emily Saunders' favorite color, gray, because it was same as hers. It probably changed, though. Everything had changed. Still, she also knew that Emily's mother worked here as one of the secretaries in the front office. She could be there now. Emily could go get her. She could get someone. Riley called out her name. Emily's head swiveled, eyes finally locking onto Riley's. There was something there. Concern? Pity? Confusion? The girl's jaw whirred back and forth. She tugged at the end of one, picked up before turning back to the door. Grace was right. Riley was on her own, which meant it was time to scream. Maybe somebody would hear. A janitor, another student, a coach. Riley didn't care if she got in trouble. Anything Principal Warden would dish out would be better than whatever Grace Turner had in mind. Help! Riley shouted. Somebody help! Grace's hand clenched forcefully over her mouth. Hush, princess, she said, close to Riley's ear. Your princes are all waiting for you. Riley felt Grace's hands on her shoulders, shoving. She lost her balance and went down backward, slamming elbows and tailbone, but managing to keep her head up. Her arms finally free, she scrambled to her feet, but it was too late. The supply closet door slammed shut. Riley reached for the knob to turn it, but heard the click just as her hand touched the metal. Twisted once, twice, pulled and jiggled. No use. She pounded on the door with both fists. What the hell? She yelled through the door. Let me out of here. This isn't a joke. Riley pressed her face to the narrow pane of glass in the door. Just as she did, Grace's face appeared opposite, her voice muffled. Shout all you want. Nobody's going to hear you. Janitors have already been through here, judging by the stools on the tables. So I'm thinking you could be stuck in here for a hot minute. She smirked again. While you're in there, I want you to think about what you did. Think about the choices you've made. She said this last part like a mother scolding her 3-year-old. Riley wasn't thinking about what she did. She was thinking about what she was going to do the second she got out. In her mind, she already had both hands around that bouncy blonde ponytail, ripping the whole thing up by the roots. Grace, you open this freaking door. Right now. Riley pounded with both fists. Grace continued calmly. I actually wanted you to think about what I'm going to have to tell my parents when they notice this mark on my face. Think about what Chris will have to tell his dad when he finds out Chris is suspended just for making a stupid joke. Think about what you can do to improve your attitude, because frankly, it sucks. You suck, Riley spat. Really? It's the best you can do? Let me out and I'll show you. Grace smiled and tapped the key against the glass gently. See you tomorrow. Riley watched helpless as Grace and her friends walked away, dropping the key back in Mr. Barnum's drawer. As they left the science lab, Emily hesitated, glancing over her shoulder at Riley's face framed in the supply closet door. Please, Riley thought, hoping she'd see desperation in her eyes. But if she did, it didn't matter. Grace tugged Emily's elbow, pulling her along. Riley screamed as the class doors swung shut. Get back here. This isn't funny. Let me out. But even if they could hear her, Riley knew none of them, not even the girl she used to be her best friend, would listen. Chapter 8. She screamed until her throat was raw. She pounded until her hands were bruised, the soft meat of her palms red. She kicked until she split the nail on her big toe, and then kicked out with the other foot. The heavy wooden door responded with indifference. The knob didn't give no matter how hard she twisted. The lock held fast. Eventually, she was the one who gave in, leaning her head against the door. She pictured Grace and her friends, probably at some fast food place, trading conspiratorial looks over French fries and milkshakes, proud of themselves for having taught Riley a lesson, proud still for having gotten away with it. She hoped they choked, all of them. Riley peered through the window into the classroom. She didn't know how long she'd been locked in. The door in Mr. Barnum's room was situated on the same wall as his black closet door and was impossible to see, even if the room lights had been on. What little bit of light was slipping through the slim windows along the back wall made eerie shadows out of the stools sitting on top of the tables, like four-legged monsters waiting to bounce. Riley didn't own a watch, and her phone, of course, she knew where it was. Celebrating B-Day with my besties. Grace Turner had been in that picture too, standing right next to Emily, her heads nearly touching. Just one more reason to despise that girl, like she needed it now. It was stupid. She shouldn't have gotten into it with Grace. She could have been home already if she just kept her head down or turned and walked the other way. She could have been curled up on the couch, flipping through Pinterest posts and putting off her homework. There was a chance her mother had already called home to check in on her, though it depended on how busy her floor was. Even if she had, there was an equally good chance that her mom had taken Riley not answering as nothing out of the ordinary, and her father wouldn't be able to call until late tonight. In other words, it might be a while before anyone sees or noticed Riley Flynn hadn't come home. There was a phone sitting on Mr. Bardam's desk less than 10 feet away. He mostly used it to call the office, but Riley knew it could get to an outside line. But between her and it stood the locked door. Of course, if she could get out of this freaking closet, then she could just leave the freaking school. Riley resumed her pounding, certain that there had to be someone still left in the halls. Even if the janitors had already swept this room, they might do another walkthrough, or some teacher working late to plan tomorrow's lesson would hear her, even through two closed doors. They would peek into Mr. Bottom's room and see the black closet light on, Riley's panic-stricken face framed in the window. But after another dozen screams, backed by the rhythm of her incessant drumming, Riley felt everything inside her deflate. There was nobody out there, which meant if she wanted to be saved, Riley would have to do it herself. That, at least, she was used to. She was nothing if not independent spirit. Her parents had always said so, sometimes with a proud smile, sometimes with a look of concern. It was their fault, honestly. She'd been raised to take a DIY approach to life, the natural side effect of having two parents with demanding jobs. Her father's work schedule had always been especially tough for her and her mother both. The hours, days, and weeks long, timetables unwavering. As a kindergartner, it had been okay, exciting even, to show and tell about her father, the engineer. He's the guy who drives the train, she said. It was a job depicted in a dozen different picture books. A man in blue and white striped overalls and a jaunty cap and maybe a little soot on his cheeks, even though the last coal-burning trains were all but extinct 60 years ago. The man in the books, it was always a man for some reason, smiled as he pulled the whistle. Toot toot, what a load. What the books don't show is how long the lonely, gray at 40 engineer is away from home. The routes that take him halfway across the country. Phone calls from small towns that you've never heard of and never cared to visit. They don't show his wife sitting up late at night watching Friends reruns because she mistakes the TV for company. They don't show his daughter huddled in her sheets, staring out the window, wishing her dad would come tuck her in and tell her a story like he does every night he's not out on the rails. But even in Riley's version of the story, the engineer always comes back, often with a gift for the little girl, in exchange for a hug and a sloppy kiss. Taffy and stuffed animals, rock candy and t-shirts with silly sayings on them, and lots of little metal model trains. Riley had a shelf full of them. They weren't just gifts, she knew, they were apologies. She always forgave him for being gone so long the very second he walked through the door. At least when her father wasn't there, her mother had been, changing her schedule to fit his. But kids are expensive, and bills can multiply, which meant more routes and more hours. More phone calls from farther away. Ultimately, that meant more shifts from mom at the hospital and less time that Riley spent eating home-cooked meals at the dinner table bracketed by both parents. More soggy microwave dinners, garnished with artificial bacon bits to give them some crunch, eaten while sitting cross-legged on the couch. More hours spent Googling the answers to homework questions that either parent might have been able to help her with had they been home. More nights falling asleep in the living room, curled up on the same sofa, math homework sitting unfinished on the coffee table next to the black plastic tray now crusted with the cold, uneaten cobbler. The loneliness that comes from having two hardworking parents while punishing schedules taught Riley anything how to take care of herself, which explains why she finally stopped shouting for someone to come save her and started looking for some way to pick the lock on the door. Riley had zero experience in lockpicking. She had experience in seeking out the house, skipping class, dodging teachers in the hall, cheating on tests, and spinning lies. But breaking and entering, or in this case, breaking and exiting, wasn't part of her skill set. She had seen at least a dozen spy movies, however, where the hero easily manages to escape from prison using a paperclip or the part with his mental ink pen. Usually it was just a jiggle and a click and the door cracked open. She was in a school supply closet. Surely there had to be a paperclip or an ink pen here somewhere. She looked around, thankful for the bright bulb buzzing overhead. The room was tiny, barely 6 feet across, maybe twice as deep. One side stacked with plastic bins labeled in Mr. Bottom's sloppy cursive, the other side lined with shelves of floor to ceiling. Riley's eyes immediately fell upon the full of large, clear, zippered bags, each containing a plastic tray with an anatomized frog pinned to it, plus a handful of dissecting tools, a pair of scissors, a scalpel, and a needle. about 6 inches long, used to poke and prod and tease, as if the students at Northridge needed any additional tools for that. Riley looked at the brass doorknob with this tiny hole in the center. The needle would fit inside, she was sure of it. She pulled the first bin from the shelf and held her breath as she broke the seal on the bag, flinching at the stench that wafted up to greet her. She reached inside carefully not to disturb the gutted frog looking shriveled and decrepit in his tray. Poor dismantled thing. And removed the probing tool before sealing the bag back up and taking a breath. She left the bag on the floor behind her and knelt by the door, carefully inserting the needle into the knob, feeling the resistance through the wooden handle of the probe, hoping that if she angled it just right, it would tap something into place and the lock would give way, like in the movies. Riley had already decided on the first thing she would do when she got the door unlocked. She was going to find the Ziploc bag with Grace's name and number on it. She was going to take that was inside of it, a post-it note, and the roll of duct tape she kept in her backpack, and she was going to find Grace's locker. She was pretty sure she knew the number. The vents in the top were barely big enough to slip a sheet of paper through, but that was all right. Riley wasn't interested in hiding something inside for Grace to find. She wanted this out in the open, public consumption. When Grace Turner showed up tomorrow morning, she'd find Riley's nasty message and the equally nasty trophy waiting for her. Riley knew that using her father's corpse to exact revenge wasn't much better than cutting it up in the name of science, but she wasn't the only one who started the mess. Wasn't the one who started the mess. Grace could have just let her pass by. She could have kept her poky little fingers stuck up her conceited little butt where it belonged. And as for Emily, Riley wasn't sure what to do about Emily yet. Come on, Riley hissed, twisting the dissecting needle around and around, forcing it, bending it, breaking it. She took a step back, the wooden handle of the dissecting tool in her hand, the metal tip completely snapped off, now jammed into the doorknob, impossible to dislodge. She kicked the door with her right foot, forgetting her already sore toe. God, I swear, as soon as I get out of here. But she didn't finish her threat, because something behind her had moved. Riley froze. She was certain she heard it, even over her own cursing. A scraping sound, like a chair being dragged across the floor. She twisted around, fully at the waist, looking back over her shoulder. Nothing, just the same row of shelves with microscopes and dissection kits and bottles of ammonia and vinegar. Plus the one bag she'd opened, all sitting on the floor, right where she'd left it. Pull together, Riley. You're all alone, remember? There's nothing here. She gave it 5 count, then looked back at the lock with the needle jammed into it, thinking about how she got stuck in here to begin with, thinking about her choices, just like Grace suggested. She screwed up. She realized that now. She shouldn't have slapped that girl in the face, but just stood there defiantly. She should have hit her and run. Riley rested her head on the window, looking toward the other door that led to the hallway, to the exit, and then to home. Down 54th Street, right on Rolling Hills, left on Hawthorne. The house with the blue shutters and the one rose bush growing out of control. How could something seem so close and so far away at the same time? It was just one of dozens of questions she'd been asking since she'd been locked in here, along with, what the hell is Mom going to say if I had to explain where I've been? And why didn't I just scream at the start when I had the chance? And how could Emily just walk away like that, like we were not even friends? Screech. Riley turned all the way around now, her back to the door, scanning the narrow room inch by inch. She definitely heard something this time. Maybe there was a mouse in here, hiding. Wouldn't surprise her. They'd caught one in the cafeteria last year and had to eat packed lunches in the classroom for 3 days while the exterminators looked for more. A building this old was bound to have a few unsavory creatures lurking within its walls. Riley slowly lowered her down to her hands and knees, her cheeks close to the cold floor so she could peer under the shelves. Cobwebs and bits of paper, a solid layer of dust, but no monsters and no mice. Yet she swore she could still hear something, a faint thumping, barely louder than her own heartbeat, but more erratic. You're being ridiculous, she told herself. It could be anything. The hiss of steam coming from the pipes in the ceiling, the chunk of the radiator, some muffled sound from the parking lot. She sat on her knees, the wooden handle of the broken needle still clutched in one hand. She looked at the tray on the floor next to her, sealed in plastic. As the frog lying there, its belly split longways, its insides exposed, its webbed feet no longer pinned to the waxy bottom of the tray like they had been when Riley first took it down. All 4 pins had come loose, in fact. Strange. Maybe she had done it when she'd opened the bag. Riley bent over, looking closely, peering through the plastic. She took a sharp breath as one of the frog's legs twitched. One of the very dead frog's very dead legs. Not possible, she thought. Not without some kind of external stimulus. That was even supposed to be part of the resuscitation unit, zapping the muscle with a low current to watch its contact. Mr. Barnum had promised they would get to it tomorrow. And yet she was sure she saw the frog's right leg jerk. There it was again, quiver in its foot. Riley leaned forward, looking into the animal's obsidian eyes, the one that had been close to her, now wide open, looking right at her. And then the frog jumped. The dead frog jumped. Somehow, even on its back and with its guts spilling out of it, it twisted and sprang from the tray, hitting the wall of the Ziploc bag that encased it. Jesus! Lily jumped just as awkwardly, twisting and fumbling, scrabbling to her feet, reaching behind her for the locked door, the bag convulsing as the creature inside continued to spastically leap against the sides of the plastic prison, as if desperate to get free. She grabbed the knob with the needle protruding from its tiny eye, forgetting in her panic that it was still locked, taking hold of it with both hands, and pushing it open with ease. Chapter 9. In a moment, maybe, she would stop to think about the house. She would ask them, one right after the other, how was the door suddenly unlocked? How did the knob turn with the needle lodged inside it? How did that frog, which had obviously been dead for weeks, packaged and shipped by some science supply company to Northwood Middle School, a frog whose veins had been injected with blue latex to make them easier to find, a frog that had been sliced in almost in half, how did that dead freaking frog freaking move? But Riley was too scared to think. Bursting through the door, turning and slamming it shut, keeping her hand on the knob, her shoulder pressed up tight out of some irrational fear, because it was completely irrational that a half-dissected zombie frog could escape from a sealed Ziploc bag, burst through the door, and come chasing after her. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath, then peered back through the window into the closet, watching the lone dissecting tray on the floor, waiting for any sign of movement, the slightest quiver, something to tell her she wasn't crazy. Whatever it was in the bag lay still. 10 seconds. 20. Okay, yeah, screw this. She just imagined it. The stress of being locked in a supply closet had caused her to see things. Maybe it was the fumes. Could you get high off formaldehyde? Maybe there was some freakish biological explanation for the frog's corpse twitch. Residual muscular energy. Some latent chemical reaction. Mr. Bottom would know. He could tell her if she ever decided to fess up and tell him what she was doing in the supply closet to begin with. She had no idea how she was going to explain any of this, now without also getting herself in trouble. But at least she was out. Riley maneuvered between the tables, using them to steady herself, everything only half in focus as she just woken up. It didn't help that the room was getting darker. Squinted up at the clock above Mr. Barnum's desk, 6:25. She'd been locked in that closet for close to an hour spent with dead amphibians, bruising her hands and yelling her throat sore. The hallway lights were still on, at least. Maybe that meant there was still someone here. Maybe they just stayed on 24/7. She didn't know. She never spent the night in her godforsaken middle school, and she wasn't about to start. This place was even creepier when it was empty. Ironic, she thought, given that all the creeps who normally hung out here had already gone home. Riley forgot her backpack tight where she left it, where the Alice had left it, tearing it from her shoulders as they wrestled her into the room. The hallway was deserted, which was fine, preferable, in fact. Now that she was out, the last thing she wanted was for someone to spot her, for her to have to explain what she was still doing here. She just wanted to go straight home, take some Advil, inspect her arm for marks, triage her broken toenail, maybe find some ice cream to coat her throat. Then she could spend the rest of the evening deciding if she should still tell her mother what had happened, what she'd done, what the other girls had done, or better yet, planning on how to get back at Grace Turner, because clearly the frog pinned to the locker thing wasn't happening anymore. The dead frog. Definitely, undeniably dead frog. She swallowed. Hard. She should have sworn that thing had jumped, flipping itself in the bag like an amphibian acrobat. And that door had definitely been locked. She tried opening it 100 times, her fingers sore from squeezing the knob so hard. But then it just turned, easy as a lie, setting her free. It all made her brain hurt. None of it made any sense. I don't know, Horatio. Maybe not, maybe so. Her dad's voice sounded in her head. It was a favorite praise of his, repeated whenever she pestered him with questions she didn't have the answer to or requests she wasn't sure he could meet, which often, I don't know, Horatio. Maybe not, maybe so. He'd say. He claimed he'd mostly borrowed it from Shakespeare, more specifically Hamlet. Something about there being too many things in heaven and earth that can't be explained. Her father would know a thing or two about the inexplicable. Connor Flynn had been conducting trains for 20+ years, and in that time he'd seen too many things that defied rational explanation. He said, a coyote on the track that disappears into a puff of smoke the moment the train hits it, mysterious green lights pulsing in the night sky, trees that seem to howl at you as your engine thunders by, sounding like human screams. Even once a person, a woman in a white wedding dress, with a long train, get it? Sitting at the tracks, arms spread wide as if waiting to embrace the locomotive, barreling down on her at 50 miles an hour. Riley's father already had his hand on the air brakes when he blinked and she was gone, disappeared. I don't know, Horatio. Of course, Connor Flynn had his own theory on the lady in white, whispered to Riley when she was cocooned in her covers. She was a bride-to-be from long ago, left standing on the altar by a cold-footed man who bailed on her on the happiest day of her life, buying a one-way ticket out of town, hoping she wouldn't come after him. But she did, not in life, but in death, haunting the tracks, searching for the train that would bring her spineless betrothed back to her so she could make him fulfill his promise to love her forever and ever. Riley's mother, however, had her own explanation. Your father sees things, he said. Hallucinations. Too many hours in that cab, staring out the window, wishing he was somewhere else. Pilots see things too. Surgeons, longshore fishermen. Work too long, too hard, and your brain plays tricks on you. It just means that you need some time off. It means you just need some sleep. None of this stuff is real, like mirages in the desert. Maybe not, maybe so. Riley wasn't a train conductor. She wasn't a pilot or a surgeon. She hadn't imagined that frog moving. Forget it, Riley. Just get out of here. Go home. Advil. Chunky monkey. Sleep. Revenge. She shouldered her backpack and went straight for the first exit at the end of the empty hall, passing rows of lockers and noticing how loud her own footfalls were when they were the only sound. The green exit sign beamed down at her, always welcome, but never too much as now. She hit the push bar with her hip, eager to face the blast of fresh air. The door didn't budge. She tried again, and again, and again, and again. What the actual hell? She whispered, momentarily forgetting her annoyance at people who misused that word. She pressed into the bar once more with both hands, but even though she could hear metal scraping against metal, the door didn't budge. Impossible. These doors didn't lock on the outside the way Mr. Bardham's supply closet did. You couldn't always get in, not without a key, but you could always get out. It was required. Imagine if there was a fire and 100 students were herded up against the exit, trampling each other to flee the smoky halls, burning to death because of the locked door. And yet the door she had her whole weight against didn't move. Neither did the one next to it, or the two next to that. Each door she tried, the push bar compressed, but the door didn't open, not even a millimeter, as if they'd been welded shut. Riley shook her head and tried all four doors again, rebounding off each one with a frustrated grunt. Okay, stay calm, Riley. You can figure this out. Maybe there was some lever or latch somewhere that allowed them to be locked from both sides. She felt along the bar, looking along the hinges, inspected where the door met the floor at the walls. Nothing. No way. No nut-sucking way. She could not be locked in this stupid school. I don't know, Horatio. Riley stared through the door's skinny window at the playground used by the neighboring elementary school. Empty, of course. It was probably close to 30 degrees out. The swings hung still. Part of her, part that remembered all her father's scary stories, expected them to be slowly arcing back and forth, propelled by some unseen force. The screech of their rusted hinges carrying all the way across the parking lot. Ghost swings. Funny. But they weren't just, but they weren't. They were just plain old swings. And these were plain old doors that should absolutely freaking work. Riley gave the last door one last kick, not so much to open it as to let it know what she thought of it. Then she turned and looked back down the hall, scanning for open classrooms. She wasn't the kind of girl who would normally ask teachers for help, always preferred to either figure it out on her own or just give up and take a zero if she thought something was a waste of her time. But this was different. Hello? Is anyone there? Her voice sounded weak and whispery, lacking the strength to carry the length of the hallway. She cleared her throat and tried again. Hello? Riley walked slowly, glancing through the thin rectangular windows of classroom doors, looking from one with the lights still on. It wasn't even 7 yet. Weren't their teachers always complaining about their long hours, slaving away into the night, stuck at the photocopier when they were supposed to be at home with their own kids? Yet this place was already a graveyard. Actually, Riley joked to herself, graveyards are full of people. Another gift from her father, a morbid sense of humor. Is anyone there? She shouted again. I think there's something wrong with these doors. Either that or there's something wrong with me, she added, much softer. She wondered what her teachers wouldn't have to say about that. She already knew what some of the other kids would say. She waited a moment for a response, but was answered only by her own grunt of disappointment. There was no one here. Riley's skin started to itch, a prickling that spread up and down her body, the unease shifting to full-on queasiness as she steadied herself against one of the lockers. Something weird was going on, something clearly beyond her understanding. She decided it was time to call for backup. Riley was only supposed to call her mother at work if it was important, an emergency or of some serious drama. but being locked inside the school with only a few dozen dead frogs as company, because they were all dead, every single one of them, would have to count as one or the other. And if her mother didn't answer, Riley knew exactly who she would call next. The Warren County Sheriff's Office to report a kidnapping of a 13-year-old girl by her own cursed middle school. Chapter 10. Every classroom had a phone, so it was only a matter of ducking into the first one she came across. Finding the phone, calling her mother, and request immediate evac from the premises. Riley wouldn't freak out. She wouldn't scream or cuss or cry. That would only make her mother panic. She wouldn't tell her the whole story either, even though Riley knew she would ask. She would only say they were stuck at school, she needed to be picked up, and that she would explain the rest as soon as her mother got here. Amanda Flynn would assume her daughter had gotten in trouble again, reporting back to a teacher perhaps, or cursing in the hallways. But at this point, Riley didn't care. She could deal with her mother's irritation, as long as she was dealing with it in the car on the way home. She and her mom didn't always get along. One of them could be stubborn, insistent, and irritating, and the other was only 13. But she knew her mother would ditch her mask and gloves in a heartbeat and come and get her if she thought Riley needed her. The first classroom was up on the right, just past the bathroom. Make the call. Get the hell out of here. Except Riley was stopped by another sound before she got there. Not the not the scritch scratch of a frog-filled bag shifting on the floor. No. This sound was distinctly human. It sounded like sniffling. She backtracked 2 steps and paused outside the bathroom entrance, head tilted. She'd heard right. From somewhere inside came a muffled sob. It was a sound Riley was familiar with. Snot, someone snotting in a bathroom stall. Maybe somebody who could help Riley get the door open. Hello, is somebody in there? Are you okay? Riley, Riley stuck her head in the entry. Please let her be an adult, Riley thought, though she immediately questioned why an adult would be sobbing in the student bathroom at 7 o'clock on a Wednesday night. Not that her teachers didn't have drama, too. Mr. Vardo was going through a rocky divorce, she knew, and Miss Witten had a kid in rehab. Remember had it that Mrs. Brendiker, the choir teacher, was madly in love with Miss Child, which was bound to be hard on Mr. Brendiker if and when he found out. And when there was Mr. Sharma, the math teacher, who was supposedly seen vaping in his classroom last week, a definite no-no. Please let it be a responsible adult, Riley amended, but it definitely sounded like a kid. Hello? Who's in there? Are you okay? Riley hated that question, and she was instantly irritated with herself for even asking it. The kid was hiding in the bathroom, crying. Of course, they weren't okay. Maybe it was someone else from the volleyball squad, a girl who had a bad practice and got chastised by the coach or even the other players, because let's face it, some of them were proven jerks. Or maybe just some girl whose parents called to say they would be late for pickup and to wait inside because it was cold out. So she came in here to hide and be miserable about any number of things. Riley turned the corner past the entrance and the noise stopped. Hello? Is somebody in there? In here? The sinks were all empty, and there were 3 of the 4 stalls. Only the last one had its green door shut. No surprise. Riley always picked the last one, too, if there was an option. It's Riley Flynn. I'm a Sevy. She seemed like an important detail to add for some reason. At Northridge Middle, you were Sevy, a short timer, or a noob, depending on your grade. She hoped the girl in the stall recognized her. Maybe they had a class together. Riley thought, even though Riley was on a first name basis with most of the kids in her grade, she at least knew most of their names. She just never used them because that would require a certain competition. Not really her thing. No more sobs came from the stall. In fact, Riley couldn't hear anything but her own shuffling steps. Whoever was in there was suddenly silent, frozen in place, embarrassed, probably, waiting for Riley to leave. That's what Riley would be doing. That's what she had done. Any other time, Riley would leave the girl alone to whimper. This wasn't any other time. I heard you crying. Riley knelt down, angling to look for a pair of feet resting on the floor. But even that wouldn't mean anything. 6 hours ago, Riley had sat on the back of the toilet with her feet on the lid because she, too, had wanted to vanish, afraid someone might recognize her by her discount faux leather boots. I'm having some issue with the door out there. I was wondering if you could give me a hand. Maybe together. A single shuddering sob escaped from behind the closed stall at the end of the row. There was definitely somebody in there. Hey, it's okay, really. Whatever it is, maybe I can help. I mean, it's not likely. Let's face it. I'm kind of a mess. I can't even seem to get out of the school by myself. She placed one hand on the door, assuming it was locked, but it swung open inward with a slow creak. Riley squinted. The stall was empty. Recently cleaned, in fact, the porcelain shining, the bowl smelling faintly of disinfectant. A new roll of scratchy toilet paper sat in the dispenser, and there was no body to pair with the voice she heard. Riley shook her head. No, I definitely heard sobbing. Someone was crying in here. And yet, Here she was, staring at an empty toilet. Riley took 3 steps back, bumping into one of the sinks on the opposite wall. She turned abruptly and caught her face in the mirror, her skin even more blanched than normal. Her sea-green eyes startled wide. She shut them so tight her vision exploded with colored spots, then opened them again, taking in the same haggard-looking face and no other. She was alone. You've got nobody. Must be hearing things, she whispered. After all, what other explanation was possible? The door to the empty stall behind her hung wide open now so that Riley could see the graffiti scratched, penciled, and sharpied into the back of it, most of it too small to read in the mirror. She shook her head and turned on the water, cupping her hands beneath the stream, welcoming its coolness. Her throat hurt. Her tongue felt thick, swollen. She took a long, slow drink, letting half of it dribble down her chin, and then went back to another. She wiped her mouth with her sleeve and looked at herself in the mirror again. Her auburn hair curtained her eyes, draping down on both sides, darkened crescents arcing underneath. She couldn't remember the last time they'd looked this tired. Okay, that was a lie. She often looked like this. Her mom was constantly urging her, sometimes commanding her, to shut off her light, close her computer, get more sleep. So she would shut off her light, close the computer, wait for the door to close, and then go back to whatever she was doing. Of course, right now she would kill to be cuddled up in her comforter with the lights off and her baggy eyes shut. Instead, she was leaning over the sink in her stupid middle school, staring at her splotchy face, and the open stall door behind her, the door. Riley leaned in and looked closer. There was something off about the door, something about the graffiti. She shook her head again. Had that been there before? She squinted past her own reflection in the mirror, taking in the backward lettering. Black marker, all caps, scrawled right in the middle of the stall door. She twisted around and looked dead on at the door itself, keeping one hand on the sink for balance. There were no big black letters at all, just the usual scrawls etched into the chipped lime green paint. Sketches of students and teachers with exaggerated features. Declarations of who sucked, did not make the list, at least not on this store, and who hated who, and tandem quote from Einstein and RBG. Riley turned back to the mirror. She froze, a cry caught in her throat. The large black letters were there on the door again, except there were more than this time. Riley screwed her eyes shut, jamming the knuckles of her thumbs into them. It's not there. It's not. It's like the noises you heard. Your mind is playing tricks on you. She was letting her anxiety get the better of her. That's when her mom would say, calm down, count to 10. Get control of yourself. Riley went all the way to 20, just for good measure, before opening her eyes again. It worked. The writing in the mirror was gone. The reflection showed a door with its usual display of scratches and crude drawings. No big Sharpie letters marching across center. See, I told you. Just chill. You're fine. Riley shook her head. She turned. The thick black marker stretched across the door. All capital letters, screaming to her. Nothing to see here. Riley screamed right back. Chapter 11. She re-entered the hallway at a stumbling run, book bag thumping off her back, feet sliding on the thick hall floor. She dove into the nearest classroom, thankful that the door opened without an issue. She didn't recognize whose classroom it was. A math teacher, judging by the laminated formulas posted all over the walls and the banner showing 1,000 digits of pi that circled the room. Maybe Mr. Sharma's, the vape master. Riley didn't stop to turn on the light, crashing past student desks, cracking her knee hard on one, and wincing as she made her way to the back of the room and the phone that hung on the wall. Wasn't real, told herself. It sure seemed real, but it wasn't. If you go back to the bathroom, there'll be no writing, no crying, nothing at all. But even Riley's more rational self didn't sound convinced, and there was no way she was going back into the bathroom. That was some serious Stephen King red rum paranormal activity nonsense, and she was done. Over it. Definitely time to go. She picked up the phone and started keying in her mother's cell number, one of the few she memorized. Boo dee beep, the phone beeped. We're sorry. You must first dial 9 before listening an outside call. Riley hissed and slammed the phone back into its cradle and then picked it up again, pressing the 9 first this time and then punching in the rest. She held the phone with both hands, pressed close to her ears. It was there. The writing was there. She'd seen it. And the sobbing. She'd heard it. Just her imagination. Not her imagination. Just the stress. Name a time in the last year or so when she wasn't stressed. She couldn't. Nothing like this had ever happened. Sure, you think you hear things sometimes. When you're at home by yourself, a thump in the walls, a stairs plaintive groan. The house settling, whatever that means. But it wasn't that. It's not as if Riley woke up this morning wandered across the hall to brush her teeth, and was greeted by angry markings on her bathroom wall. It was something else entirely. The phone rang once, twice. Come on, pick up, pick up, pick up. 4 times. 5. Mother wasn't answering. 6 times. 7. Riley waited for the sound of her mother's voice. Hi, you've reached Amanda Flynn. Sorry I'm not available. Please leave me a message. But the voicemail never kicked in. Riley lost count of the number of times she let it ring before she hung up. More than 10, closer to 20. She put the phone back gently this time, taking a deep breath before picking it up to try again. She didn't forget to dial the 9 this time. She pressed the numbers carefully, listening for the accompanying tone. 1 ring, 2, 3, 4. Riley danced, tapping her feet, spinning in place, glancing over at the door that led to the hall that led to the bathroom, with the stall that said there was nothing to see here, because there was nothing to see there. But there had been someone in there. Riley heard her. 8, 9, 10. Answer the freaking phone. After 15 rings, Riley slammed the phone back into its cradle with a crash that carried through the dark room. Okay, it was okay. There were 100 reasons why her mother wouldn't answer. She was with a patient. She was filling an IV. She was up to her elbows in either paperwork or piss, to use one of her mom's favorite phrases. But it should have gone to voicemail, unless there was something wrong with her mother's phone. The phone here seemed to be working just fine. Wasn't it? There was an easy way to test that theory. She could try calling her dad. But the truth, the shameful truth, was that he didn't know his number. Dad was the one you went to when you wanted to play a card game or build with Legos. The one you counted taking you to the mall to buy bubble tea. He was the one Riley invited to her own tea parties when she was little because he had the more pretentious British accent and held his plastic cup all snooty-like with his pinky finger up. But he wasn't the one you called an emergency. That's what your hard-headed, no-nonsense ICU nurse of a mom was for. Truth was, Riley only had 3 numbers committed to memory. Hers and her mother's were 2 of them. She couldn't even remember Emily's phone number. It had been so long since she needed it. Not that she would have called her, even now, no matter what she did. Riley picked up the phone one more time and keyed in the 3rd number she knew by heart. Mario's, the pizza place 3 blocks from her house. The one she called whenever her parents worked late and she got tired of microwave dinners. Brilliant, Riley. You can't get in touch with your own father, but you can order deep dish and a side of cheesy bread. What are you going to do? Have them delivered to the school? Was an awful idea. But even as the phone started to ring, Riley began to get that feeling. The one that starts from the surface at 1,000 tiny stings, prickling that somehow brings the heat to your cheeks and sends a rush of cold to the core of you, squeezing you from the inside out. That certain dread that the test you're handing is an F, that the text you sent to someone you think might like you will be laughed at. The audible frown of the dentist who pokes too long at the same tooth, the one that you lied and said didn't really hurt. Feeling that nobody's going to answer the phone, no matter what number you dial. Maybe she didn't know how to use the phones. Maybe the lines were down, the system not working. Maybe. Maybe I'm dreaming, but the throbbing in her knee from where she'd banged into the desk suggested otherwise. After 20 rings, Riley hung up again. There was one more number she could try, though she'd never dialed it before. Not even when she broke her big toe doing a solo gymnastics routine in the living room, or one of her afternoon alone, jamming it out into the coffee table on a misjudged roundoff. She just iced it and kept watching the Olympics until her mom came home, taken to the ER. Not even when she thought some such-looking thug might be casing the house, looking for a way in so he could kidnap her, though he turned out, ironically, to be a screwy alarm salesman hanging a brochure on their doorknob. Neither of those had been emergencies. Was this an emergency? Like that kind of emergency? I considered what she would say. My name is Riley Flynn. I was locked in the supply closet by a band of vindictive volleyballers, and now I can't even seem to open the freaking door of my school to go home. Please send help? Yeah, that should do it. She picked up the receiver, unsure if you had to dial a 9 for dial 911. We're sorry, your first dial, ugh, Riley said, slamming the phone again. Right back up, finger pressing hard on the 9, then 911. 1 ring, 2, 3, 7, 10. Riley shouted something that no doubt would have gotten her sent to the principal's office had there been a soul around to hear her, letting the receiver slip from her hands, dangled by its coiled cord and swinging back and forth like a body from the gallows. So either the police department was unreachable or the phone really wasn't working, like the doors that refused to open, almost as if the school was working against her, trying to keep her here. Now that's crazy, she thought. It was completely crazy, terrifyingly crazy, impossible crazy. Riley stood by the desk that stared out the bank of windows to the parking lot. No cars, no late after-school buses, no parents idling in the pickup lane, waiting to interrogate their kids about their day. Empty, and across the barren parking lot was a sidewalk that would lead to a street that could take her straight to her neighborhood. Just one on the other side of the super window. Window. Riley shook her head, beating herself for not thinking of it. Screw it. Who freaking needs a door? She was staring at a way out. She recalled the time last year when the building's air conditioning quit. It was late August. The school year was barely underway. Emily Saunders hadn't even moved to town yet. By the end of the day, the whole building reeked, and every teacher had their windows pushed as far as they would go. Only the bottom section slid open, so it did little to dispel the heat, but at least the teachers could say that they tried. Bradley appraised the rectangle of space she would have to fit out of, 16 by 24 inches. It was possible. Riley wasn't skinny exactly, not like the pixie sticks who ate only salad and seaweed straws for lunch, but she was flexible. She thought of the YouTube videos of cats and dogs squeezing themselves through fence slats. If she could get her head and shoulders through, the rest would surely follow. Leaning over the sill littered with crumpled paper and candy wrappers, Riley released the sliding lock with a click. So far, so good. She braced her palms against the upper lip and pushed. The lower section of the window moved slowly, protesting her efforts with a squeal that made her spine shudder. But unlike the door, at least the window moved. Up 1 inch, 2 inches, three, before suddenly stopping. She could feel the rush of cold air pricking her already prickly flesh. Riley strained, planting her feet and pushing as hard as possible, but the window wouldn't budge any higher. For every action, there is a reaction of equal or greater force. Her sixth grade science teacher, Mrs. Milford, taught her that. But what force kept the windows from opening more? Was it jammed? Had she busted it? Riley stood and inspected the gap she'd made. 3 inches. Enough for that breath of fresh air. Enough to summon the sound of a tree branch rustling, shaking of its first dry, dead leaves at her. It was enough to get one arm through, maybe. Riley braced herself and tried, again, this time clamping her fingers along the bottom of the window, which was thin and sharp against her skin. She pulled up, teeth grinding, muscles trembling. She could feel the edge of the window biting into her palms. The cold air continued to roll over her. Then she felt something else, something strange, like a shift in the pressure of the room. She sensed it on the fine hairs that ran up and down her arms, which still stained against the window. She heard a creak and looked up. She barely had time to pull her hands away as the window came crashing down, dropping like a guillotine, slamming hard into its sill. Smash. Riley stumbled backwards, staring at her fingers and then back at the window. What the hell? She shouted, not even sure who or what she was shouting at. Riley stumbled backwards, staring at her fingers and then back at the windows. What the hell? Wait. She tried again, straining, pushing, but this time the window held fast, not even giving her an inch. She tried the one next to it. Nothing, just like the door. No matter how much force she applied, the windows did not move. This was really not good. When something happens once, it is an oddity, an outlier, maybe not easily explained, but at least it could be dismissed or forgotten. But when it happens over and over, I don't know, Horatio. Riley let herself fall into the swivel chair behind the desk. This time, the sniffling she heard was her own. She could taste the hot mucus in the back of her throat. Door stuck. Phones operational. Windows shut tight. On top of it all, she was seeing things, hearing things, feeling things. Because she did feel them. She did feel them. She sensed something. Perhaps it was just the burst of cold air. Something hung heavy in the space around her. Almost palpable, but not quite. Riley could tell when things weren't just right. She could sense when her parents were about to get into an argument. For example, picking up on the strain of their voices, the shortness of their sentences, every word clipped, her mother's jaw tight, her father's hands stuffed in his pockets so Riley couldn't see him making fists. She had the same feeling now. No, there had to be some rational explanation. Maybe the cold weather had frozen the door shut. Maybe the phones were on the fritz. Maybe she'd really unlocked the supply closet door with her amateur picking attempt and just hadn't turned the knob hard enough. Maybe I'm just going crazy, I whispered. You're not crazy, said a voice. It seemed to come from beneath the desk, from right by Riley's feet, and yet not. But you're all in trouble, the voice added. Riley put her palms, still creased red from the window's edge, against the side of the desk and slowly pushed herself backward, looking down past her knees. to the frog staring up at her with its dead black eyes. Chapter 12. When something happens once, it can sometimes be dismissed or forgotten. Let it slide. You attribute it to circumstances beyond your control. It was a random event, a one-time only thing. It wouldn't happen again. You told yourself it had nothing to do with you. Like the first time Emily turned on her. With hardly anything. A moment. Harmless. Silly. Stupid. They'd been sitting at lunch, just the two of them like always. 5 days a week for the last 5 months. Hamburger day. But Emily hardly ate much of it, the once frozen meat frisbee sitting between a smushed flat bun. Riley got a grilled cheese instead, pointing to Emily's uneaten lunch as one of more reasons to go vegetarian. Burger day meant steak fries, though. The long wedges that were way too much potato and not near enough fried, but were still worth it as a ketchup delivery system. Emily had been acting somewhat off all morning, nothing specific, just a little distant, distracted. But at lunch she seemed to warm back up, laughing at Riley's impression of the drama teacher, Mrs. Shenkins. Seriously, have you seen her clap? I'm telling you, total seal. Riley slapped her hands together in near imitation. Plus she has whiskers, just a little bit of a stash. You can tell if you look real close. Not nice to make fun of your teachers, Riley knew, or anyone really, but if mocking Mrs. Shenkins would cheer her best friend up, then it was a worthwhile sacrifice, especially when your best friend was in fact your only friend. Riley treated Emily's happiness as if it was her own. Emily rolled her eyes, but she was smiling at least. She does wear that great jumpsuit a lot, she said, which is more walrus than seal, I think. I think you're right. Riley glanced down at her plate, fished up the two biggest steak fries, and bit off the ends. Then she jammed them beneath her teeth and upper lip, contouring her mouth to make them stay there, her two new walrus tusks dangling down past her chin. She began to clap and make what she thought were walrus barks. Herf, 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 herf. Close french fries with like oversized vampire fangs threatening to fall. Emily laughed. At least she started to. But then her eyes caught something over Riley's shoulder, and she stopped and looked down at her tray. Riley turned, her potato tusk still wedged into her mouth, half expecting to see the lunchroom monitor or a teacher hovering over her. Please, Mrs. Shenkins, ready to admonish her for playing with her food. Instead, she saw Grace Turner glaring at her from the next table over, her face contorted into a look of pure disgust. Normally, Riley wouldn't have smiled real big for her, or shoved both fries into her mouth, overstuffing it, making it a big production of biting off way more than she could chew. But it was Emily that stopped her, the way her friend curled up, looked away. Her smile vanished. The message was clear. Riley was embarrassing her, right in front of those other girls. She slowly dislodged her tusks, setting them gingerly back into the little cardboard boat. She didn't feel like eating them anymore. She let it go. It was nothing. It meant nothing. Hardly worth remembering. Riley had been acting like a fool. Since it was only the beginning, the first letter scrawled backward on the bathroom door. Eventually, Riley would get the whole message that things had started to change between them, that Emily had changed. Riley did her best to ignore all the signs. The curt text responses, the excuses for suddenly being busy on a Saturday night, the once casual conversations that became stilted, conversations that began to feel more and more like Riley talking to herself. She ignored them because it was easier than facing the truth, that her best friend and only friend was starting to pull away. Even with all the evidence, Riley shut her eyes and told herself it would work out somehow, because she wouldn't let her let go. Chapter 13. The frog hopped once before it flew. It flew because Riley kicked it. It was all reflex, the way you swat at a mosquito that buzzes past your ear. Of course, she'd said the same thing about slapping Grace. This time it was true. She didn't think, she just kissed out with her right foot, setting the creature with its bisected belly and its flopping innards soaring 10 feet, straight into a wall where it hit without a sickening slap. She didn't see what happened to it after that. She was already halfway across the classroom, headed for the hallway, and then to the front door, the main entrance, the only door in the building with an automatic opener. In her moment of panic, her intense desire to get away from whatever that thing was there was that had just talked to her. It had talked to her, hadn't it? Thought struck her. Just slam the dead button with the wheelchair on it and get the hell out. Riley ran down the hallway and turned the corner. The lights were off in all the rooms she passed, the doors all shut. The building was completely empty. No, not completely. There is somebody, something here with you. Riley tried to force the thought out of her head, the image of it, sitting in the shadows by her feet, looking up at her, telling her she wasn't crazy, proof that she was crazy, or at least headed in that direction. You know what you saw. How could she see what she saw? How could a partially dissected frog get out of a shut supply closet and follow her through the school like that? It was dead. No, not dead. It moved. It blinked. It talked. You are in trouble. As if she needed the dead frog to tell her that. Riley turned a second corner, finding herself in the vestibule, the painted profile of the Northridge Panther growling up at her from the marble floor, collages of Mr. Foot's art glass lining the walls, and the huge sign saying welcome in 20 different languages stretched from wall to wall. Welcome, benvenue, nayak, yakoso, salam. Nope, try again. Try goodbye, Riley thought. Au revoir, sayonara, adios. Without showing, Riley surveyed the administrative offices with a sliver of hope, but all the lights were off there as well. Nobody home. Then one day she wanted to see Principal Wharton's frowning face, or Emily's mother. She could tell her what a terrible kiss-ass, crown-following, spineless bystander her daughter had turned into. Save her for later, Riley. Just get out of here. She slowed to a walk at the entrance and practically pinched the metal square with the blue wheelchair engraved into it. Punched, waiting for the whine of the motor that would open the doors. Come on, she hit it again and again and again. Come on, come on, come on. Nothing. No mechanical buzz. No grinding gears. The front doors didn't move. Riley reared back and kicked the button as hard as she could, hard enough that she was sure she'd break it. Kicked it again before throwing her whole body against the door, leading with her hip and shoulder, but rebounding off it like a ping pong ball. It wasn't just the doors in the Sea Hall that were shut tight. The front doors were closed to her as well. Her specifically. That's what Riley was thinking, because that's what it felt like she'd been locked in the school on purpose. The irrational idea popped into her head that somehow Grace and her friends were still the ones behind this, that they had somehow shut her in here. It was a reach, she knew, a long shot, a long one, but it was as good as any other explanation, which meant it was really no explanation at all. The outside beckoned to her through the thin sheet of glass in the doorway, only a few feet away, so close and yet seemingly impossible distance. Riley glanced behind her across the lobby to where the hallway split, looking up for the lump of a dead frog come to life, chasing after her, its shriveled entrails smearing the floor. Instead, her eyes fell on something else, the small red box situated next to the office, the fire alarm. Pull down, it commanded in bright white letters. Didn't need to ask her twice. Chapter 14. It wasn't the first time Riley had pulled the fire alarm, or even the second. The first time had been on a dare. In the fourth grade at Brightwood Elementary, Missy Reynolds and Sharonda Parker conned her into it. They were unanimously, if not officially, declared the two most popular girls in their class and flaunted their pricey puffer jacket and their glittery red gel pens, which they used to make cootie catchers when they were supposed to be writing in their competition notebooks. Riley was beguiled by their whispered conversations and their vaunted friendship bracelet making abilities. So when they promised to sit with her at lunch the next day, if she did something for them, she knew it was her ticket to rising up the fourth grade ranks. After all, it wasn't that hard of an ask. Just pull the handle. She didn't realize that there were cameras in the hallways. She didn't know how easily she would be caught. When her mother found out what she'd done, and more specifically why, she sat Riley down and showed her an ancient-looking video of lemmings, adorable, fuzzy little gerbil-like creatures, following each other blindly off a cliff. One by one, the fur balls would take the lead, plummeting hundreds of feet down, a hollow look in their tiny eyes as they jumped to their possible deaths. That's you, her mom said, pointing to a random lemming somersaulting towards the icy water below. Or at least it was you today pulling that alarm. Don't do something like just because somebody tells you to. Don't follow other kids over the edge. Learn things for yourself. In the video, a platoon of drowned lemmings washed slowly up on shore, the bloated bodies knocking against each other. It was a massacre. Riley could hardly stand to watch, but she did, because her mother made her. And don't ever pull another stunt like this again, her mother added. Riley nodded, but later that night, haunted by the image of the lemmings catapulting themselves to the doors, she snuck down to the computer in the living room and looked it up. Turned out her mother didn't give her the whole story. Lemmings don't blindly follow each other off cliffs to die. They're actually migrating, looking for a better place to live. Though many of them don't survive the journey, it's worth it for those who do. It's how the species survives. Which was what Riley was taught all along. Following the crowd can be worth it if it leads you somewhere worthwhile. Her mother didn't know how hard it was for her to make friends, to fit in. She just wanted to sit with Missy and Sharonda at lunch. Instead, she had to eat in the principal's office for the rest of the week. When she told the two girls everything that had happened and asked if she could eat with them the next week, instead, they laughed. Sorry, no rain checks, Missy told her. Riley got nothing out of the deal, save for one lesson about lemmings and another about hallway monitoring systems. At least the next time she pulled the fire alarm, she was prepared. Beginning of sixth grade, a math quiz she was destined to fail because she hadn't bothered to study. So she fished a baseball cap out of her backpack, tucked her hair underneath, and put on a jacket right from lost and found. She snuck out of the bathroom, pulled the alarm, and then merged with the herd, all of them crowding and pushing their way through the doors. Perfect crime. Unfortunately, a description of the prankster went out over the email that afternoon, and students were asked to open their backpacks so that teachers could check them. Riley's Red's cap sold her out. She tanked her quiz the very next day. Riley's mother was furious this time. She made her call her father and tell him, even though he was on the train 500 miles from home. Disappointment in his voice devastated her. You can't shrink responsibilities, Riley. There are no easy outs in life. Some things are just hard and you have to suck it up and face them head on. Do you understand? She understood. Problem it felt like everything was hard all the freaking time. She made her promise right then on the phone when she faced a challenge, she wouldn't back down. She would deal with it. She would be strong. And that would do the right thing because that's the kind of girl she was. Strong, capable, determined. The kind of girl who didn't shrink from the fight. There were challenges, and then there was this. And this, whatever was happening to Riley right in this moment, was beyond the scope of anything she had ever experienced, which was why she didn't hesitate to pull a fire alarm for the third time in her life. It gave a satisfying, reassuring click, and everything instantly went dark.